The last letter. The gravel crunched under my boots as I stood alone beneath the overcast sky of redwood pines, shivering slightly, with one hand clutching a worn leather keychain and the other buried deep in my coat pocket. Behind me loomed the funeral home, where my brother-in-law Travis stood grinning like he'd just won the lottery, while inside my father's coffin lay surrounded by a cascade of white flowers. My father, Samuel Miller, had been incredibly wealthy. As CEO and founder of Miller & Sons Construction, he'd built a multi-million-dollar empire from nothing, leaving behind an estate worth nearly $200 million. When the will was read, my name barely appeared. Travis Monroe, my sister Angela's husband, had somehow swept in and claimed it all. The man who'd been sweeping floors at Dad's company just months ago now stood on the front steps like a king surveying his new kingdom, flashing a Rolex and announcing to anyone who'd listen that he was now CEO, estate administrator, and majority shareholder. And me, I walked away with a beat-up 1995 Ford F-150 that looked like it had been through a war. Travis slipped on his designer sunglasses and muttered just loud enough for me to hear, "That truck's perfect for you, Ethan. You always were low maintenance." I stared down at the key in my palm, feeling the cold metal and cracked leather. I should have felt humiliated, angry, betrayed. Instead, beneath all that expected emotion, I felt something else entirely, a low hum, a pull, something almost alive. That night, after everyone else had gone home, I climbed into the truck. The driver's seat still bore the imprint of my father's body worn smooth from years of use. The engine turned over with a sound like an old dog reluctantly barking back to life, and then something extraordinary happened. The navigation screen flickered on, displaying a route that had already been programmed. No address, just a name of a place I'd never heard of, and a thin blue line stretching into the mountains. My father had never been one for technology, barely knew how to use a smartphone, let alone program GPS coordinates. My heart was racing as I stared at that screen, and somehow I knew I had to follow it. So I did. The old truck rumbled beneath me, like it was carrying more than just rust and worn tires, like it held secrets that were finally ready to be revealed. As I drove through the darkness, watching the redwood pines blur past in my mirrors, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. The call from Angela had come 3 months earlier. I was grading papers in my empty apartment when my phone buzzed. "Ethan, it's Dad. He has cancer. Stage 4. My hands went numb. I didn't ask what kind, it didn't matter. The next morning, I submitted my resignation. No goodbye parties, no farewell emails, just a simple note on my classroom door. Mr. Miller had to leave, but he left you all with a lifetime of learning, so it's not all bad." I drove home that same day, not to claim any inheritance or business stake, but simply to be present to spend whatever time remained with the man who'd raised me, and maybe finally to bridge the gap that had grown between us over 15 years of silence. The house smelled of lemon oil and old papers unchanged since I'd left. Mom looked older, smaller somehow, but her eyes brightened when she saw me. Dad sat in his recliner, pale and gaunt, reading through construction contracts with the same methodical attention he'd always given his work. When he looked up and saw me standing there, I caught something in his eyes, surprise, maybe relief, possibly regret. The silence stretched between us like a chasm neither of us knew how to cross. But I stayed. I managed his medications, drove him to appointments, cooked meals, mowed the lawn, sat with him through chemotherapy sessions, held a basin when he was sick, and sometimes we just sat together in that companionable silence that had defined our relationship for so long. He rarely spoke directly to me, but occasionally when I helped him shave or tucked a blanket around his legs, he'd whisper a quiet, "Thanks, son." Those 2 words filled a void in me that had been empty for years. Then, on a gray September morning, he was gone. Angela, Mom, and I were there when he took his last breath, and for the first time, I understood that his love had been there all along, unspoken, but real. I had trusted Travis Monroe completely. As a foreman at Dad's company, he'd been punctual, reliable, and charismatic. He could fix a burst pipe and quote Theodore Roosevelt in the same breath. When he started dating my sister Angela, I was thrilled. The weight of being a Miller had always felt heavy, and I thought I was gaining a brother who understood the burden of living up to Dad's expectations. During those late evenings on the porch before they married, we'd drink cheap beer and share stories about our lives. He told me about his humble beginnings in East Texas, how much he admired my father and his dreams of building something meaningful from the ground up. He even encouraged me to change my major. "Ethan, you've got a way with kids," he said once. "Leave the concrete to your old man. You go out there and teach people how to live." At the time, I thought he was being genuine. But when I returned home to care for Dad, Travis had become someone else entirely. He avoided me, spoke in clipped tones, and moved through the house like a consultant, making mental notes. He'd question Dad about his will, suggest changes to business operations that nobody wanted, and seem oblivious to the way the room fell silent whenever Dad groaned in pain. One night he cornered me in the hallway outside Dad's room. His voice was low and sharp when he said, "Pretty convenient how you showed up when the old man started dying, hoping to win back his affection with a few kind gestures." I stared at him stunned. "I came back because my father is a good man," I replied. Travis laughed short and hollow. "Save it. You abandoned him 15 years ago. No need to play the saint now." His words cut deep, but it was his tone that disturbed me most, cold and calculated, like a man rehearsing his closing argument in a trial. Then he stepped closer. "Look, Ethan, you can play nursemaid all you want. Feed him soup, hold his hand, sing him lullabies. The decision's already been made." "What decision?" Travis stepped back and smiled. "Samuel's already chosen his successor, and it wasn't you. So not only are you losing the money, you're losing your legacy too." I sat on the porch that night with my hands clenched so tight I could barely see the stars, furious, not because of the money. I'd never cared about that, but because I was watching a man I'd once respected systematically manipulate everyone I loved. He'd played us all perfectly. When Dad was struggling, Travis would appear with expensive gifts, play the devoted son-in-law, then disappear before any real work needed to be done. When Dad needed help with paperwork, Travis would conveniently lose the documents. When Angela asked him to stay overnight with their son Noah, he always had meetings. But he never missed golf games with board members or business dinners with potential clients. I started watching him more carefully, noticing how he was dismissive toward Mom when no one was looking, how he called the office his and treated me like a ghost haunting his territory. Around the same time, Angela began to change too. She smiled, laughed quietly to herself, nodded along even when her expression suggested disagreement. That's when I realized Travis hadn't just replaced Dad at work, he was trying to replace him everywhere. But Travis had underestimated one crucial aspect of my character. I wasn't driven by power, I was driven by justice. And the more he revealed his true nature, the clearer my purpose became. It wasn't about claiming what was mine, it was about protecting what was ours. The GPS coordinates led me deep into the mountains, to a place that didn't exist on any map. The paved road gave way to gravel, then dirt, as the trees grew thicker around me, like nature was trying to hide something precious. Finally, I found it, a small wooden cabin nestled between two ancient redwoods with faded white paint and a front porch that held a single rocking chair. No mailbox, no power lines, completely off the grid. I stepped out of the truck with my heart pounding. This place was more than remote, it was forgotten. As I approached the porch, the door creaked open and there stood my mother. "Ethan," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I was hoping you'd come." I froze. Mom, what are you doing here? How did Dad's truck know about this place? She gestured for me to come inside, her hands shaking as she reached for a teapot that was already warm on the wood-burning stove. This was your father's sanctuary, she said quietly. He bought this property years ago, believing that every man should have a place to think clearly. I looked around the sparse interior, a table, 2 chairs, a handmade bookshelf filled with blueprints and philosophy books, and an old photograph of my parents looking genuinely happy despite their work-worn faces. You never told me about this, I said. Because it wasn't time, she replied. This was where he found peace, but he always intended for you to have it when you were ready. She pulled a worn envelope from a drawer, my name written across it in Dad's precise handwriting. I hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a letter, the ink slightly faded, but every word as clear as his voice. Son, I may not have said this enough, but I've always been proud of you. Even when it hurt me to watch you choose your own path, I respected your courage. I confused control with leadership, and for that, I'm sorry. The words hit me like a physical blow. I read every line as if I were a drowning man clinging to a lifeline. He wrote about his own failures, his secret pride in Angela's reports about my teaching career, and his deep shame at not knowing how to bridge the gap between us. But the part that shocked me most came at the end. Travis didn't fool me. I saw his ambition, but I was tired, son. Sometimes I felt so helpless that I wanted him, or someone like him, to just take over. But I could never give him what mattered most. That's why I asked your mother to keep this safe. Mom pulled a metal lockbox from beneath the floorboards. Inside were documents, deeds and certificates, financial records, property titles, investment portfolios, all in my name, all legitimate, all legally binding. He gave this to me before he died, she said in a strong, clear voice. Not to hide it from you, but to protect it from Travis, to make sure you and Angela would always be taken care of. My mouth fell open. It wasn't about the money. It had never been about the money. It was about the truth. He had seen me, had been proud of me, but had been too proud himself to say it. Mom placed her hand gently on mine. He trusted you to handle this the right way. He believed in your judgment more than anyone else's. I sat there in stunned silence as the scent of pine drifted through the open window and a blue jay chattered outside. For the first time in years, I felt something I'd almost forgotten: peace. Not defeat, not anger, just a deep, settling calm. My father hadn't left me powerless. He'd given me something far more valuable than a title or an office. He'd given me the truth and the tools to use it wisely. I spent that night in the cabin, sitting by the fireplace and reading the letter over and over like a child trying to memorize his father's voice. This time I wasn't carrying shame or resentment. I was carrying clarity. Dad hadn't given me his business or his title, but he'd given me something better: the truth and the wisdom to know when and how to use it. Travis Monroe thought he'd won. He assumed the board would fall in line, too intimidated or loyal to question his authority. What he didn't know was that most of those men owed their livelihoods to my father's integrity and vision. So I started quietly, carefully. I arranged private meetings with the 4 executives Dad had trusted, most men who'd worked alongside him for decades and who'd been watching Travis's systematic destruction of the company's values. I never suggested a coup or spoke of revenge. I simply told them the truth. I showed them Dad's letter, the documents, the cabin, the fact that Travis couldn't legally access half the assets he thought were his and morally deserved even less. They listened. At first there was skepticism. "Ethan, you haven't worked a day for this company. You just left. Why now?" I looked each of them in the eye. "Because he's destroying the very foundation my father spent his life building." The silence that followed was profound. Then, slowly, deliberately, they began to nod. Within 2 weeks, I had acquired a controlling interest in the company, partly through the hidden shares Mom had protected, and partly through buyouts made possible by the assets Dad had secured for us. Every acquisition was crucial. Every detail had to be perfect. Because if Travis caught even a whiff of what I was doing, he'd strike first. Angela provided unexpected support, asking pointed questions at family dinners that made Travis uncomfortable. She'd stopped trying to compensate for his absences, letting her silence speak volumes about her growing disillusionment. I played my part perfectly. Travis still saw me as the failed teacher, driving Dad's old truck, irrelevant and defeated. To the world, I was nothing. But in the shadows, I was rebuilding an empire, one vote, one share, one relationship at a time. When everything was in place, I called a special board meeting. Nothing dramatic, nothing grand, just one line on the agenda: leadership review, urgent. It was time for the roles to reverse. Travis might have taken Dad's name, office, and desk, but I had something he could never steal: the truth and the resolve to use it. The morning of the board meeting, Redwood Pines felt unusually quiet, as if the entire town sensed something was about to shift. Travis arrived in his black BMW expensive suit and Bluetooth headset, barely acknowledging the receptionist as he strode into the glass tower that bore our family name. He entered the boardroom with the confidence of a king returning from conquest. But when he saw me already seated at the table, his expression changed. "What the hell are you doing here?" he growled. "Get out of my chair." Nobody moved. I kept my hands folded calmly on the table. "Travis, you're in the wrong room." He laughed bitterly. "You've completely lost your mind." I gestured to the folder in front of him. "You should read that first." He opened the file. Page after page of signed affidavits, proof of my controlling interest, minutes from the emergency shareholder vote, and his formal termination. His face contorted as he read. "What the hell is this?" he said, his voice shaking. "This is your exit," I replied quietly. He stood there, trembling papers in his hands. "This will never hold up in court. You think you can just erase me?" "No," I said, rising from my seat. "You erased yourself. Unauthorized business trips, misuse of company vehicles, padding individual expense accounts." The room fell into oppressive silence. "By all means, call your lawyers. Fight it. But the board is unanimous. You're done." He opened his mouth, but no sound came out, like a man watching his own reflection shatter. Then came the final blow. I slid a second folder across the table. "What's this?" he whispered. "Personal electronics travel expenses contracts signed in your name and charged to company accounts, evidence of systematic theft. You didn't even try to hide it." "Who gave you this?" His voice was barely audible. I said nothing. I didn't need to. He could see it in my eyes, in the faces of everyone around the table. Everyone could see what was coming. He looked around the room, hoping someone would defend him. No one did. The show was over. Then Angela walked into the room. She wasn't crying. She wasn't angry. She was calm, with a serenity that was more terrifying than any rage. She placed a plain white envelope on the table beside him. "What is this?" Travis asked, his voice hollow. "Divorce papers," she said simply. The echo of those words filled the silence. For a moment, the only sound was the fluorescent light humming overhead. She continued in the same steady tone. "You betrayed this company, and you betrayed me. You left our son to chase dying men's dreams while ignoring their pain." Travis stumbled backward. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," she said. "And you can fight this all you want, but this time it's over." He made a sound like a wounded animal. He grabbed for everything: his briefcase, his phone, his dignity. But his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold anything. Watching the man who had carried himself with such arrogance finally face the consequences of his actions was profound. He had lost everything: the job, the money, the title, the office. Even the family he'd married into had turned away from him. I didn't gloat as security escorted him from the building. I didn't even smile. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. For my father, for Angela, for Mom, for myself. I felt the weight of the elevator doors closing on Travis Monroe, like the end of a long, painful chapter. The silence that followed was deeper, more complete. And for the first time in years, the name Miller meant something real again. A week after the boardroom confrontation, I returned to the cabin, not for strategy or planning, but simply to breathe. The air there was always thick with pine needles and possibility quiet in a way that made you listen to your thoughts, your heart, your mistakes. I sat at Dad's desk, lit the old wood stove, and made coffee in his dented tin pot. As I explored the drawers, I found something extraordinary, a leather portfolio tucked away at the back filled with letters. Dozens of them. All written by hand, all addressed to me, all unsent. The first one made my chest tighten. Ethan, I saw you on the news today. That award your students gave you. I watched it 3 times. You looked so proud and happy. I never knew a man could feel joy and regret at exactly the same moment, but here I am, your old dad crying into his whiskey like a fool. I read every single one. Letters written from construction sites, hospital rooms, the back porch of our family home. With each one, Dad's defenses crumbled a little more. You were right to choose your own path. I was wrong to fight it. I may never tell you this, but I see you now. And I like the man you've become. There were letters from birthdays, holidays, even one written after his first chemotherapy session. Funny thing, the man who built skyscrapers is scared of a pill the size of a Tic Tac. I'm trying not to be a coward, but I admire your bravery. He'd spent his entire life building walls, and every letter was a crack in that foundation. When the letters kept coming, those walls finally crumbled, leaving just a father who had no other way to express love except through words he was too afraid to send. He was going to tell me. He just never found the courage. But he wrote it down, over and over again. I read straight through until dawn, chasing the ghost of a man who had finally let his guard down. Somewhere between letter 17 and 33, I forgave him. Not because he'd asked for forgiveness, because he'd tried to give love the only way he knew how. I learned that sometimes love whispers, sometimes it hides in drawers and waits for the right hands to find it at exactly the right moment. As the sun came up, my phone rang. It was Noah, Angela's son, my nephew. A bright kid, smarter than most adults I know, calling at 10 years old with wisdom that humbled me. "Hey there, buddy. What's up? Shouldn't you be getting ready for school?" He looked serious for a kid wearing a Pokemon t-shirt and holding a half-eaten waffle. "Uncle Ethan, did you really fire Uncle Travis?" he asked, his brow furrowed. I winced. "I didn't fire him, Noah. The board." "That's awesome," he said, syrup making his jaw work harder. "Mom says you're the real hero," I laughed. "Is that what she said?" "She says you're even smarter than Grandpa. Is that true?" The question caught me off guard. "Your grandpa was a great man, Noah. I'm just a guy trying not to trip over his own shadow." He nodded, chewing thoughtfully. Then quietly, "When I grow up, I want to be like you." That hit harder than any boardroom victory. "Yeah," he nodded again. "I used to want to be an executive, wear suits, talk in meetings, all that stuff. But now I think I want to be a teacher." I leaned back in my chair, feeling something tight in my chest. "Why's that?" "Because teachers and you help people. You made Mom smile again. You took care of Grandpa when he was sick, and you never yelled at me for accidentally factory resetting your phone." I found myself laughing out loud. Noah grinned sheepishly. "Sorry about that, by the way." "Apology accepted," I said. "On one condition." "What condition?" he asked, grinning. You helped me build something. Like a shed, he asked, tilting his head. Bigger, much bigger, a place. I told him my idea without sugarcoating it. A storytelling center, right here in town. For kids. A place where they could tell their stories, make their voices heard, say what the adults in their lives were too scared or stubborn to say. A place where every letter could be read out loud. He lit up. Can I help design it? I'd put in beanbags and comic books if it were my dream room. Absolutely, I said. And waffles. Definitely waffles. We ended the call with a virtual fist bump. Sitting there with my phone still warm in my hands, I realized this was the legacy I was meant to protect. Not a company or a fortune, or even my father's name, but the idea that a 10-year-old kid could believe kindness was a superpower, and that one ordinary man reading old letters in a beat-up truck could change the world one story at a time. These days, time moves differently. Not the heavy silence that used to trouble me, but the quiet that comes after a long storm when the wind stops howling and the windows stop rattling and you can hear your own breathing again. The Miller house feels warmer now. Not because we rearranged furniture, but because we've learned to wear silence like a comfortable old sweater. Angela laughs again, real laughter that lights up rooms and makes hardwood floors feel less hollow. She's painting again with the same passion she had before. Deadlines and disappointments drained her creativity. I catch her humming quietly in the kitchen while Noah does homework at the table, and the sound fills spaces I didn't even know were empty. Mom stays busy tending her garden with the reverence of someone caring for a cathedral, talking to her tomatoes like they're grandchildren. Her movements have become more deliberate, more peaceful, as if she's finally released the weight of things left unsaid, and me, I'm back in a classroom. Not with desks and bells and grades, but in the little cabin Dad left behind. We transformed it into the Miller Storytelling House. Kids come from all over town, shy ones, bold ones still figuring out who they are. We give them pencils, paper, and permission to write their sadness, their questions, their dreams. We don't grade anything. We don't call anything good or bad. We just listen. Because sometimes that's all anyone really needs. Noah comes by after school sometimes when his backpack feels heavy and his mind is racing. He's working on a comic book about a retired construction worker who secretly builds playgrounds for kids. Completely fictional, he insists. I believe him, mostly. At the end of each day after the kids go home and the sun sets behind the trees, I love to sit on the porch with black coffee and a good book. The same porch Dad used to sit on. Did he know? Did he plan this? Did he realize that a truck, a cabin, and a drawer full of unsent letters were exactly what I needed to find my way back to him and to myself? Maybe. Or maybe life just has a funny way of leaving breadcrumbs when we need them most. My anger has faded now, dissolved. Travis is gone, irrelevant. Healing isn't about getting over trauma. It's about choosing to keep moving forward when your heart feels broken. These days I walk with gratitude instead of resentment, whether I'm stepping on gravel mud or polished hardwood. Grateful to a father who tried. Grateful to a family that endured. Grateful for second chances that come quietly wrapped in beat-up trucks and handwritten notes instead of pretty bows. We're all flawed, but we're also whole, and that's enough. I've learned that love doesn't always speak loudly. Sometimes it whispers through worn work boots on concrete floors, through coffee passed silently from hand to hand, through a hidden cabin filled with letters too precious to send. Love isn't always eloquent. Sometimes it's messy, imperfect, arriving late wearing old flannel, carrying nothing but guilt and hope. But it's still love, and it still counts. I've discovered that legacy isn't what we leave behind in boardrooms or bank accounts. It's the values that outlive us. The quiet kindnesses, the handwritten notes, the courage to show love without demanding acknowledgement in return. I've learned that forgiveness is possible, even when we're imperfect, that small acts of kindness can transform lives in ways we never imagine. I've learned that healing takes time, arriving in waves unexpected and gradual. One day you're brought to tears by a letter you never expected to find. The next, you're laughing at a joke you thought you'd forgotten. But it comes. Time doesn't heal everything, but it teaches us to let go of grudges that serve no one, to write our own peace when apologies never come. So here's what I know. Build your life carefully. Be loud and loving if you can, quiet and loving if you must. One small act of kindness can ripple outward in ways you'll never fully understand, whether it starts in the cab of a broken-down truck heading toward an unknown destination, or in the quiet corners of your own heart. The journey isn't always easy, but it's always worth taking. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you discover that the love you thought was lost was just waiting patiently for you to find your way home.